BibleWorm, reading the Bible with BibleWorm.
Welcome to BibleWorm, getting to the core of the biblical text. I'm Dr. Amy Robertson, Director of Lifelong Learning at Congregation Or Hadash in Sandy Springs, Georgia.
And I'm Dr. Robert Williamson, Professor of Religious Studies at Hendrix College and the founding pastor of Mercy Community Church in Little Rock. We're here every week to discuss the biblical text, both as biblical scholars and as people of faith, one Jewish and one Christian.
This week, we read Luke chapter 6, verses 1 to 16. We draw out the connections between King David and Jesus early in their careers, both walking through the world as God's anointed before anyone really knows it. We think of the debates between Jesus and this group of Pharisees as akin to the debates that encircle our public health crisis. And we wonder for a moment what it was like for the man who was minding his own business at synagogue one day when a part of his body, his withered hand, became a location for this debate. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Bobby, how are you?
Hey, Amy, I'm good. How are you?
I am doing well. We gave ourselves a present this week, and it was a very random present. Would you like to know what it was?
Of course I would, yeah.
I mail-ordered tamales from Texas.
What?
It's a completely ridiculous thing to do, because surely there are fantastic tamales within, 2 miles of my house.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
my husband is from Texas,
Yeah.
and I went to college in Texas,
Yeah.
and I don't know, it brightened our spirits.
So these are it's not like a tamale kit. This is like...
No,
somebody cooked
they're
tamales.
cooked tamales in corn
Put them
husks.
on ice, sent them to
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
That's intense,
Yep.
man.
And then I also they had chocolate tamales that sounded so gross and curious that we ordered those too, but we haven't eaten them yet.
Yeah, chocolate tamales.
And the description of them on the website was basically like, these are not as bad as you'd think. And I was like, well, right on. I'll take that.
That's funny. Yeah.
Well, today we are in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 to 16.
We are, yeah.
So, shall we?
Let's go.
We shall. Okay. Chapter 6, I will start with verses 1 to 5, and I'm reading the NRSV. One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked some heads of grain, rubbed them in their hands, and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'" Okay, so the laws of the Sabbath. Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?
Yeah.
I mean, the Torah teaches don't work on the Sabbath,
Right.
We've got that. You're supposed to rest.
Right.
But doesn't specify what that means. Like,
Right.
if someone tells you not to work, you and I can interpret that in lots of different
Right.
ways.
One of the concepts that I learned in our graduate program that was really helpful to me was the idea of building a fence around the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I understand it anyway, you've got a law in the Torah, and you want to make sure you don't violate that, whatever it is. And it's often not entirely clear what it is. So you create a set of laws at some distance from that specific thing, just to make sure if you break one of those laws, you haven't actually broken the Torah law. You've just stepped over the fence.
Yeah.
And so then there's some debate then about so how far from the key law should the fence be built to make sure we don't actually violate the Torah?
Right. Right. It's like those, lines that you're supposed to stand behind that are close to the subway tracks.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that you can't cross the line and something's not going to happen to you immediately, but if you get too close, you might lose your balance and fall in or get pushed in or whatever. So
that's one of the things that I think is helpful in terms of framing this passage. Is one way of thinking about what's happening here is Jesus and some of the Pharisees are arguing about where the fence ought to be. There are other things that are going on here too, for sure, as we'll see. But I think that's one of the things is that issue of how strict does the observance need to be?
You know, it's interesting for me to read this text in the context now, the modern context of our public health catastrophe, our public health situation.
Yeah.
But, I mean, Deuteronomy could not be more clear that we must keep the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Or we will face dire consequences.
Yeah.
Like, we will be kicked out of the land of Israel or destroyed or abandoned by God. Like, it's very serious. And it's not that one individual person who breaks the law will be. It's that, Kol Israel Aravim Zelazeh. All of Israel is responsible for each other. And so one person's behavior has dire consequences, potentially, for the entire people.
Yeah.
So if they believe that this is a life or death
Yeah.
situation in the long run, then it starts to sound like public health to me. Like, it starts to sound like COVID. Like, all of us, or many of us at least, can agree on general principles of what we ought to be doing. Like, stay away from people.
Yeah.
That's what we ought to be doing. Wear a mask.
Yeah.
But there's so much within that.
Yeah.
That different authorities will tell us slightly different things, and different individual people or sub-communities within the broader community have different, tolerance of, do you wear a mask if you're outside and sitting 6 feet from someone? Some people do. Some people don't. Some people say if you keep it too strictly in the first place, you'll get exhausted.
Yeah.
And then throw it all out the window, which is like the fence around the Torah argument.
I think that's a super helpful way of framing what's going on. And I really appreciate that you're raising the issue. Like, there are stakes here. If you really believe, which both the Pharisees and Jesus do, that Torah observance has consequences, or lack of Torah observance has consequences, whichever way you want to frame it. I think that's super helpful. And so this is a dispute about the health, well-being, and future of the community. And Jesus and the Pharisees have different takes on it. I love that. I love that comparison. Luke actually says, some of the Pharisees, tenes de ton Pharisaion. And just to say, sometimes the Gospels are the Pharisees, do X, Y, Z. Luke says some of the Pharisees said this. And, maybe that just means that all the Pharisees weren't in the field. But what I think it means is, maybe not even all the Pharisees would have had the same concern with Jesus, but there is a group of, within the category Pharisee, there's a group of them who think what Jesus is doing is a problem. But you might imagine that there are other people who also identify as Pharisees for whom this wouldn't be a problem, that there's a dispute, an internal dispute that's going on here. That
is so important, that to draw out that not even the gospel is saying this is a monolithic group.
Right.
The groups are made up of people.
Yeah.
And,
that's absolutely right.
Okay. So then Jesus' response is fascinating.
It is so, in so many ways, yeah.
So can you regale us with the story of David and the bread of the presence?
Yeah, so the story is in 1 Samuel 21. And basically at this point in the story, David has been anointed by Samuel as king, but Saul is still the king.
Right.
And so it has become clear to David and Jonathan that Saul is not pleased. And so David has had to run away from Saul. So as he's running away, David comes to the shrine at Nob, and Ahimelech, the high priest, is there. And David says, I'm really hungry. I need some food. And the only food that is available is the bread of the presence, which is sanctified bread that only priests are supposed to eat. And David says, but I'm really hungry. My people keep a careful observance. When we travel, we're always maintaining ritual purity. So we need the bread. And so the priest gives him the bread. And so he eats bread that is designated for priests, even though David is not a priest.
Yeah, and then as it turns out, sort of afterwards, when Saul finds out that the priest helped David, not only by giving him bread, but by giving him Goliath's sword that happened to be sitting around in the shrine, there's a huge massacre of priests because Saul thinks that they're in league with David, which they're not. But this is it's a mess. This is just a big mess, this story.
Yeah.
Why would Jesus tell this story?
The straight ahead comparison Jesus seems to be making is David was hungry and he ate the holy bread. And so my disciples are hungry and they're eating grain that's not even holy, but they're doing it on a holy day. And so if David can do that, then my disciples can do this. Like it's not a big deal. But within that sort of framework, there's a few different sort of issues that are going on. One of them, I think, is just like, when do you make exception to things that are sanctified? So we've made an exception to the bread of the presence, so we can also make an exception to the Sabbath. The other is, I think, Jesus is comparing himself to David here. We know that he is from the line of David, that he is understood in Luke's gospel to be the Davidic Messiah. So he's saying, if David has that authority, then how much more authority do I have, because I'm his descendant and also, by the way, the Messiah.
Also.
But you see, yeah, so those are some of the things that I see when I look at that. What do you see going on in there? Anything different?
I mean, I see pretty similar stuff. I mean, I would point out that David is not exactly known for his deep, like, care for priestly norms or, I mean, he is exuberant in his love for God, but a little messy sometimes. But he is, at the end of the day, he is the chosen one. David is the chosen one.
Yeah, that's right.
And the story of David, I mean, reading those last chapters where David's been anointed, but Saul is still king, it's kind of sad. Like, it's kind of pitiful to watch Saul try to hold on to things.
Yeah.
But in some ways, it's a story about the new guy coming in, like God's chosen one coming in and doing what he sees fit. And the people of the previous establishment are not going to like it. It's not going to make sense to them. And in some ways that is what is happening here.
Yeah.
By citing David, he's sort of claiming the authority of the chosen one.
I think that's right. Yeah. And you use the word authority just there, which I think is a really important word for this text. And David ate that bread, and he did it really on Saul's authority in kind of an interesting way, but he did it on his own authority I'm in charge of this place. And so at some level, like, I can do what I want. Yeah. And Jesus now seems to be sort of saying the same thing. Like, I have the authority over this day and over every day, so I can kind of do what I want. And I like the connection you're making, which I had not made, of the sort of shifting of regimes, who is able to wield authority. And we've got a shift from Saul to David, which is at least implied in that text. And then we've got a shift from religious leaders, the Pharisees, to Jesus.
And I love that you pulled out the fact that David has been anointed at that point, but he has not been crowned king.
Yeah.
So it's like the change has sort of already happened, but the people don't know it yet.
I love that. The story has not caught up to the change in either case. That's really nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now then we get this thing in verse 5. He said to them, in the CEB, the human one, in the NRSV, the Son of Man, is Lord of the Sabbath.
So, there's a Jewish teaching from this time period that, in the Mechilta, that the Sabbath is given to the Jews. It's not the Jews are given to the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, we're not supposed to be slaves to the Sabbath. The Sabbath is in a lot of ways like is a gift. It's not that it's not challenging to not do work. It is, but it's supposed to be something that is given to the people. So there is this general teaching that we don't want to be so overly controlled by the Sabbath that it sort of feels like we are at the mercy of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So I think that's at play here, but I think there's more than that.
Son of Man can also be a reference to that text that we talk about on here every once in a while in Daniel 7, where at the sort of culmination of history, when the empires are destroyed, authority is going to be given to one who comes from heaven, who is called in Daniel 7 the Son of Man. And Jesus is often understood in the New Testament as being that figure who receives that authority. And so on that reading, Jesus, like what's happening here, is Jesus is uniquely the divine representative of God's power on earth. In the other reading, Jesus is like a person like among all the people. And this where it says the human one is the Lord of the Sabbath could either mean like people are made, or the Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath, which is what you're connecting with the rabbinic tradition. Or it could mean like Jesus is the one who carries all God's authority, and so like he can do whatever he wants on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
In my mind, we ought to read, maybe I always say this and it sounds so trite when I say it every week, But like we can read that in both of those directions at the same time, that the sort of ambiguity of that term. And so on the one hand, Jesus wields God's authority and so decides what does and does not go on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
And also the principle is that Sabbath is to be something to the benefit of human beings and not that human beings need to be subservient to the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's exactly right. And I think standing in that center place and sort of pointing in two directions and that kind of ambiguity, like let the listener understand kind of thing, that ambiguity and that sort of walking this line comes up in the next story too.
Yeah, it does for sure.
Are you ready to go on?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so picking up then in verse 6. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so that they might find an accusation against him. Even though he knew what they were thinking, he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come and stand here." He got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?" After looking around at all of them, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So he's teaching in the synagogue. There's a man whose hand is withered. The man doesn't ask for anything.
Nope.
He seems to just be in the synagogue on Shabbat.
This is an interesting one because it says the legal experts and the Pharisees were watching Jesus to see if he would heal. And Jesus realized that's what they were thinking about. And so he's like, okay, like let's do this thing. It reminds me just a little bit of back in Luke 4 when Jesus read Isaiah 61 and everybody was like, that was amazing. And he's like, but I know what you're really going to say. And then he like provokes people and almost gets thrown off a cliff. Like Jesus is kind of doing the same thing here. Like there is nothing outwardly that has been said or done that leads Jesus into this like situation. He just says, I know what you're thinking about. And so let's, I'm going to do this thing.
I'll
Let's
play.
do it.
Yeah, I'll bite. Let's do it. So he asks them a question.
Yeah.
Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?
Yeah.
What do you think about that question? Why does Jesus ask that particular question, or why in that way?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And, we're talking about like, where is the fence around the Sabbath?
Yeah.
And so we've established that there's an issue of whether one can shuck grain on the Sabbath. Now we're raising an issue of, well, okay, but what about a human life?
Yeah.
It seems like more people would agree with Jesus on the principle that one can save a life. In fact, Jewish tradition is pretty clear about that, right? That
Jewish tradition is totally clear about saving a life. Saving a life, pikuach nefesh, beats out everything else all the time in every situation.
Yeah.
So as I read the question, like, to save a life, yes, that is lawful.
But what constitutes saving a life?
What constitutes saving a life? And what is to do good? Like, yeah, like how does to do good relate to save life?
Yeah.
And
how does healing a guy's withered hand relate to saving a life?
Yes.
Because, if the guy was like bleeding out on the floor of the synagogue.
There doesn't seem to be any urgency here. As far as we can tell, he's not in pain.
He
doesn't ask for anything.
He's not asking for help. He's just like, the guy's just there, it seems like.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's what's the issue is it's not like, can you save a life or can't you?
Right.
It's that issue of
if you can save a life,
then what else? Yeah.
What does that mean? Like, what are all the ways that can look?
And interestingly, Luke is specific here in the way that the other Gospels are not, that this is his right hand. Luke gives us that detail.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the right hand is the more important hand in this culture. It's the hand of power. And so it seems like the guy has the use of his other hand. And so, one assumes that he can eat and pick up, like he can do all the things. He's just doing it with his offhand. And so, it's a real borderliney situation about whether Jesus needs to be doing this kind of healing. And so he seems to be sort of pressing that boundary to say any act that improves someone's station in life or their experience of life, that restores some wholeness, or there's at least a perceived lack of wholeness, that fits under this rule about saving a life on the Sabbath. So he's just made that category of what can you do? Saving a life means anything that brings people closer to their whole selves or something like that.
I'm just so struck in this story how much what's happening is between Jesus and the scribes and the Pharisees.
Yeah.
And like this guy with the withered hand is kind of, I hate to say a prop, but
That's
like
where I was going to go too. Yeah.
like the only, like Jesus is mostly talking to the Pharisees and the scribes.
Yeah.
Trying to demonstrate something to them.
I think that's right. And I have not read a disability awareness interpretation of this passage, but I think there is one there. And
There's got to be, because that's, yeah. Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, I think that's exactly right. Like the using of this person as a prop, healing someone who has not asked for healing, like calling him out in public to stand up and do this thing when he didn't ask for that. Like there's a lot of problematic things in this text and in the way that Jesus interacts with this person. So it's easy to think, well, of course he wants his hand to be restored. And maybe he does. But the way that Jesus does it, I think what you're saying there about this man has become a prop for a debate between religious leaders is exactly right. And that and there ought to be a caution in there about the way that we engage people in our own sort of religious and political debates.
No, I think that's right. I think in some ways, what is helpful to me is that in some of the other healing stories, I know you know that I have struggled with why Jesus heals some people and not other people, and what it means for people in our world now who need healing, who are not going to get that kind of miraculous healing of body. And it feels so sort of emotional and personal to me.
Yeah.
And so I think in some ways it's helpful to me as a reader to see this story take place in a way that really seems to have nothing to do with that guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, like the specific healings serve a broader purpose or a broader message than the personal, emotional one that I always tend to draw out.
I love the way Jesus operates because he never does exactly what you think he's going to do. He heals this guy, but all he really does is he says, stretch out your hand. And when he stretches out his hand, it is healed. And it's a passive voice there.
Yep.
And so Jesus didn't touch him. Jesus didn't say anything. Jesus just said, like, show me your hand. And there's his hand and it's healed. So technically, Jesus didn't, he's evaded the question at some level, right?
Yes, he's evaded the question. He has evaded any direct accusation of doing anything on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
He hasn't done anything. He said, stretch out your hand.
Yeah. But clearly he's done it, right?
Clearly he's done it.
Yeah.
But you can't point to anything that he's done because the Sabbath law doesn't specify, don't heal people with your mind. Or, I just totally picture him locked eyes with the Pharisees and the scribes, while the hand is stretched out and then healed, and Jesus raises his eyebrow, what you got?
Yeah. I did that, but you can't
point to
prove that I did that. Yeah.
That is correct.
I love that detail. I love that interpretation. And then in verse 11, the CEB is they were furious. The Greek word there is actually the word annoios, which is...
Oh, man. They were annoyed?
They were annoyed, really. But it's like that. They have been provoked to the point that they are just mindlessly infuriated.
Yes.
And I think
madness.
That what we were talking about just now, I think is part of that detail, is he proved his point in a way that they can't do anything about.
Yes. They have totally been bested.
Yeah, and they've lost their minds about it. Yeah.
Yes, they have lost their minds about it. I think the last question that I want to ask about this little section of text is, when it says they discussed what they might do to Jesus.
Yeah.
What is that? I don't know. What do you think are the realm of things they might do to Jesus? Toilet paper his house?
Yeah. Throw eggs at him. Yeah.
Yeah. Annoy him back.
I mean, it's an interesting question. One of the things to keep in mind, I think, is that Pharisees and legal experts didn't have direct, really religious or political power as such. Power resides in the chief priests and the temple and the Sadducees. Power resides in the Roman authorities. Or maybe, since we're in Galilee, maybe with Herod. But it doesn't, there's nothing really that they can do without convincing someone else to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they could say Jesus has violated the law and then convince the Sanhedrin that Jesus has done something worthy of being punished, but they don't really have evidence for that.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also a concern here that Jesus has become really popular with the people because he's healing them and teaching in a way that they haven't seen before. At least that's the way Luke tells it. And so you've got to do something to Jesus without having the people turn against you.
Right.
And so it's kind of an interesting position where the Pharisees and the legal experts feel like Jesus is doing things that need to be disciplined, but they don't really have any access to disciplining him.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to watch him and see what he does. And eventually, as you know, at the end of the gospel, Jesus is going to do some things that they can then demonstrate to others that Jesus is a problem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Should we go on to the last little section?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Picking up in verse 12. Now, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who is called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. My first question is about the difference between disciples and apostles.
Yes. A disciple is basically someone who follows a leader and learns from them and, does some stuff for them, but is basically in the behind position, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Jesus seems to have lots of disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he's done now is selected from the lots of disciples. He's selected 12. And the word apostle means somebody who is sent or somebody who is commissioned.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, Jesus is handing off, I think, some of his authority to this group of 12 who are being sent into the world to sort of do alongside Jesus. They're not going to get out in front of Jesus, really, but they've sort of moved from the following along behind to the now you are partners in this ministry. And then once Jesus has been crucified and resurrected, then the apostles in the book of Acts are going to carry out Jesus's, then they are going to be the ones who are taking the lead.
Right. People who can sort of act on Jesus's authority in some way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's both the sort of here's the 12 who are the inner circle. That's part of the difference in disciple and apostle. But what you're saying is that difference of your charge is different. You now have some authority. Yeah, I think that's important.
How do you think he chose these folks?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I love in this story is that Jesus goes out to the mountain and he prays all night. And and then he comes back and the first thing he does at daybreak, as soon as the sun comes up, he gets everybody together and he says, look, these are my 12.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think this is a story about Jesus withdrawing from his life to spend some time in prayerful discernment.
Mm-hmm.
And after a night of prayerful discernment, this is what he's come to. So I assume that the praying and the calling are related to each other.
That would make a lot of sense. Yeah, I like that.
I also think it's interesting to put this story right on the heels of that other story. The line right before this was the religious leaders had become furious with Jesus. And now Jesus is okay, you guys are my 12. And there's something about I don't know if Jesus feels like he needs, a posse or Jesus is saying okay, now that there's friction here, now being an apostle means something different. And so now you're prepared. I don't quite know how to read that, but I think that's important that this happens right at this moment in this gospel.
And, as you pointed that out, I was thinking too, if, they already have been watching Jesus and now sort of all the more so, they're very concerned about what Jesus is doing. And so by allowing this other group of 12 to act on his authority, in some ways it's I want to say it sort of has diffused the power a little bit. It's not only Jesus doing it. It's, that this power is in all these other people's bodies or selves or whatever also. And so it's a little bit harder for people who might be trying to stop Jesus from doing this to do that if now he's working in 13 different bodies,
Yeah, that's important. Do you make anything of that, the number, when you read the number 12, that's a significant number, obviously. Where does your head go with 12?
My head goes to the 12 tribes. yeah, that Jacob, who is renamed Israel in Genesis, has 12 sons. And then at the end of Genesis, there are 12 tribes that sort of go forth as like the people of Israel.
Yeah.
And, the priests who go into the holiest spaces wear like a chest plate that has 12 stones on it representing the different tribes. And like that I don't know, there's just a sense of like, this is the start of the people.
Yeah.
Like from Israel, there are 12 tribes. And so it does seem like from Jesus, there are 12. I want to say mini Jesuses, but that's not right. They're not mini Jesuses. But like 12 shaliachs, 12, apostles. Yeah. That's, to me, that's the resonance I see.
So we know Simon from the story that we read from the boat.
Mm-hmm.
We also met James and John in that story, Peter's companions in the fishing enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
We have not met any of the rest of these folks.
Yeah, and the footnote in the Jewish annotated New Testament says that in the different Gospels, the lists are slightly different. I don't know if they mean the order. They mean the order of the names.
No, I think there's 9 of them who are the same in all 3 Gospels.
Okay.
All 3 synoptic Gospels. The Gospel of John never names the whole group, but then there's 3 of them that vary.
But Peter is always first. The rock is always first, and the traitor Judas is always last.
Yeah. That's an interesting detail. And Peter becomes the sort of disciple who represents the other disciples in that kind of way. Mm-hmm. And then Judas, I don't know what you say about him. Maybe he represents something that is also true of disciples.
Yeah. All right, Bobby, we have come to the end of our reading for this week. What message would you pull out?
In my mind, what's central in this text is this issue of what takes precedence on the Sabbath, or what takes precedence, if you think beyond the Sabbath to just like within the confines of religious statutes more generally, like what is important. And in this text, it seems clear to me that the position that Jesus is taking is that acts of mercy always should supersede religious law. And so what's our responsibility as believers is to be merciful to people. And Jesus has a pretty expansive definition of what merciful means here. It's not simply if it's a life or death situation, then you could turn your attention to somebody. But it's if there's somebody who is not able in this moment to live in the fullness of life, like that needs to be a priority for you. And he's saying, and this is sort of like the most expansive way you can think about this. That's how you ought to think about it. Mm-hmm. And I think in my mind, this is, it's liberating and also troubling for those of us who are members of religious communities, because we do have things that are important, like following certain kinds of traditions are important, and thinking about the way we do things properly, in my tradition, decently and in order, like that is important. But what this text seems to be saying is there are times when setting aside what seems to be proper in order to do what seems to be just is not just important, but kind of urgently important. And your definition of what is urgently important needs to be really broad. So your first orientation to what does it mean to be God's people in the world ought to be doing justice more than it is following religious structure. I think that is crucial. And I think that's really kind of freeing in its own way, kind of exciting in its own way. Like you can read it as a critique, but I think you can also read it as an inspiration. Like, hey, y'all, let's go out and do justice. And you can kind of sort out the religious details of all that later. But what really matters is the wholeness and well-being and thriving of people.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the way you describe it as freeing, and like that we don't have to sort of get mired down in the argument part of it, which there is an argument part of it, but to have that as your charge, to like go out and do justice and do mercy.
Yeah.
The devil's in the details.
Yeah.
Like going back to that, like the public health example that's so like heavy on my mind these days, we can agree, modern Jews and Christians and many other faith communities can agree, do justice and do mercy. That's what it is. Like that's the teaching.
Yeah.
And then there's so many details under that of what exactly that looks like. And this text, to me, you're right, is a hashing out of some of those details from from perspectives that are both really bought into the public interest. Like, no one is acting selfishly in this text. Everyone is trying to do what they think is best for the whole, and they disagree about that. And it's hard to read, and it's hard to read in this story because, we know already, like, Jesus is the hero of this story.
Yeah.
And so, and so you don't want to be on the wrong side.
Yeah.
Fine. But in the moment that things are unfolding, it's hard. You don't know who's I think there is some obligation to engage earnestly in those conversations about what the details look like, because the details directly impact all of us. Like, this is a sort of religious public health, social health situation. It's not just every person should do whatever they see fit.
Yeah.
And so I think, I don't know, it's a hard text to read as a Jewish person in some ways because you know that, like, oh, maybe I'm projecting, but, like, that the author is like those Pharisees, like,
yeah,
because you know who the hero of the story is. But if you take it out of that context and just, I don't know, see it as like earnest debate about some really important questions, I think there's a lot of holiness in that. And I think, I don't know, I think that's what like earnest religious life is trying to figure out the overall public, social, spiritual health issue.
I love that. And, when this text says, oh, those Pharisees, it actually says, oh, some of those Pharisees.
That's true. That's true.
Which implies that there are other Pharisees who are taking different stands. And so in that sense, I don't see this as Jesus versus the Pharisees. I see this as an argument within a tradition about how do we balance careful religious observance with mercy and justice. And there's a lot of positions one can take. What I really love about what you said is that the argument also matters. And one way of reading this, I think, is like, once you have engage the arguments, like, absolutely. But when the argument is unclear, err on the side of justice and on the side of mercy. To me, that is a really helpful. So it's not get rid of the arguments, but it's when you come to a point where you don't know what's the right thing to do, the answer is mercy.
Yeah.
The answer is justice. And that, in my mind, that can sort of overcome all sorts of divisions that don't necessarily need to be there, specifically among, in my own traditions, people who argue about certain kind of legal boundaries and like what's allowed and what's not allowed. If the answer is like, when we come to a point where we can't agree, the answer is mercy, then that's helpful.
Yes.
And you can also read that as, well, what do we do as Jews and Christians, who are related but not related in all these complicated ways? Like, we can go together to a certain point, and when we reach the point where we can't go any further together, the answer can be mercy. And I think that even can be a productive thing for us.
I love that. I think that will get us really far.
Yeah.
That will get us really far. Yeah. All right, friend. Next week, we will be in the next chapter, Luke chapter 7, verses 1 to 17.
All right, Amy. Thanks so much for a good conversation. See you next time.
Yes, enjoyed it. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of BibleWorm. If you'd like to hear the rest of our conversation about this text, join our Patreon at the extended worm level or higher to get access to extended episodes. You'll also find other goodies like early access, video lectures, weekly liturgies, and more, starting at just $4 per month. Visit patreon.com/BibleWorm podcast for details.
BibleWorm is produced by Bobby Williamson and edited by Joel and Laura Becker. Our theme song is sung by Colin Bagby. We're grateful to all our supporters for helping us keep the podcast going. A special thank you to our executive producer, Fox Valley Presbyterian Church in Geneva, Illinois, and to our newest supporter, Janine Goodrich.
Join us again next week when we'll be discussing Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 17. Until then, keep on digging.